you are ready. Shoot.
Okay, so welcome to MINDfields. I'm Ragnhild Nordas, and today we're talking with Nils Gleditsch here at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. And Nils Petter has been in peace research since the mid-60s, and so he will have a lot of insights, I hope. The first question we wanted to ask you is, what research of yours are you most proud of?
Well, if you look at my citations, it's obvious that what I'll be remembered for will be the work on conflict data. First of all, the joint project we had with the Department of Peace and Conflict Research at Uppsala University on extending their time series for armed conflict back to 1946. The idea was to create an alternative conflict measure with a lower threshold as an alternative to the Correlates of War project, war data. That the idea was to create a standard tool for conflict researchers, and I think that succeeded. So of course that work gets cited very frequently. Then a few years later, responding to a comment from Nils, who said that, well, the number of conflicts is going down, but how about the severity of conflict? How about mortality? Aren't you comparing apples and pears by looking at small conflict and large conflicts in the same statistics? So we took up that challenge, and Bethany Lucina developed the new data set on battle deaths. And that's also become a bit of a standard tool, and seems to be regarded as the gold standard of battle deaths data, even by those who attack it. And quite a few people, of course, have challenged the data, say they're not representative of the total of war deaths and so on. But it wasn't meant to reflect war deaths, it was meant to count battle deaths. And I think, again, that succeeded in becoming a standard tool. Now, in intellectual terms, you want to know what I'm most proud of, this answer may surprise you, but some of the work I did in mathematical sociology with Tord Høyvik in the early 1970s is actually some of the work that I personally found most exciting.
I don't know this work.
No, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised you don't. But in one article, we were able to show a relationship between integration and unipolarity and what was the third concept? I didn't have to look it up to find out where it was. Sorry about that.
It's okay.
Yes, centralization and integration and unipolarity. And then in the second article, we looked at how you can explain dyadic interaction, and we found that the sum of interaction at the nation level provided an upper bound for the amount of variance you can explain in dyadic interaction. That may sound very abstract, but if you think of most studies of dyadic interaction today, whether it's trade or other forms of cooperation or is war, the explanatory variables are mostly measured at the nation level. There are very few truly dyadic variables. Geographical distance or proximity is one of the few that's sort of in standard use. I think to a large extent this is a data collection issue, because if you have n countries, then you have n over 2 dyadic combinations, and with 200 nations, and if you want to do this for, let's say, a 50-year time period, you can see that the data collection effort becomes quite substantial. So there are good reasons why people prefer to collect data at the nation level, but it does provide some limitations for the analysis of dyadic data. but again, you've never heard of those studies, and we published them in a, I wouldn't say obscure, but a mathematical sociology journal that not too many peace researchers read. Most of my colleagues were not terribly interested in this work. My co-author drifted out of the area, and I started doing some other things.
Yeah. So the second thing we wanted to ask about is what led you to undertake the research project for which you are most widely known? If it is some of the later work. Or
well, I think you have to go back to, if it's okay, I'll go back to why I got into peace research in the first place.
Okay.
My entry into the academic world was a combination of an interest in social science and in pacifism. I became a member of the Norwegian section of the War Resistance International in, I think, about 1958. The leading light of that association at the time was Johan Galtung, who was also, of course, a leading sociologist and the founder of the Peace Research Institute. So he combined a value orientation and an approach to social science that I appreciated, and out of that came a natural desire to join PRIO, and I got a chance to do that as a research assistant in January 1964, which was the time when PRIO received its first government grant. And then I guess I'm personally relatively conservative. I usually say that I've had this, worked in the same place, had the same wife, and lived in the same place, all for about 50 years. So I just stayed on at PRIO. But of course there's so many other people have been to PRIO and left and gone elsewhere. So I feel that by just standing still at PRIO, I get to meet quite a few new colleagues anyway. But one of the interesting things about the relationship between peace research at the time and the conflict data we now collect is that a key point in using the new conflict data is to illustrate the decline of armed conflict. Actually, it seems that decline takes place over a much longer time period than we've collected data on. But we found that the number of armed conflicts increased after the end of the Cold War. And in the battle death data set, we found that although it's not an even development, there's a clear decline in the lethality of war since World War II. Now that is not something that was clear to us 50 years ago. You go back and look at the literature then, there was much more pessimism around. And I think that was due to the Cold War and the threat of nuclear catastrophe. And we were all very much concerned with that, and I don't think we realized that at the same time as there was this threat of disaster hanging over us, we were still going through a change in values and behavior that made the use of violence ever more redundant as a tool of human interaction.
So was it more curiosity about what the trend looks like than that you had a particular idea about what it looks like and you wanted to document it, that led you to the collection of this conflict data?
Yeah, I think in the case of the conflict data project that we did with Uppsala around the turn of the century, we already had an idea. We had a pretty good idea that armed conflict was declining after the end of the Cold War. In the case of the battle death data, it was much more an open issue. And of course, some of the people associated with the Chorus of War projects have always been saying that war is not declining, it's just moving from one form of conflict to another. I think they're wrong, but it was not uncommon to believe that.
Now the third question that we wanted to ask you is, looking back at the evolution of the field over the course of your career, what do you think should have received more attention?
Well, I can name a few things that I think we devoted too much attention to things that proved not to be so fruitful. But in general, let me say that I sometimes get asked this question about where's the field going, where should it be going, and so on. And I usually refer to a book by Peter Winch on the idea of social science that I read about 50 years ago, where he quotes a jazz musician who says, "Man, if I knew where jazz was going, I'd be there already." And that's generally my attitude. If I knew what was the coming field, I'd be there. I feel that occasionally I have been there, but I'm sure in a lot of other cases I've missed the train. But I think one major difference between peace research when I started to become interested and now is that we are very much concerned with dependency theory. My MA thesis was on the International Airline Network. Actually, I got a lot of flack from my more politicized colleagues for choosing such an arcane topic. But this was inspired to some extent by Galtung's work in Latin America, where he had taught sociology in Chile for about 2 years. And he had noted that when he wanted to fly from one Latin American country to another, you very frequently have to go to the US and then come back to Latin America. And same thing is very much true of Africa. If you want to go from French colony to British colony in Africa, you have to go to Europe and then come back. And so Galtung called this the feudal pattern of interaction, with the overlord sitting at the center and the underlings or the underdogs communicating through the top dog. And sometimes direct ban on communication between the underlings. Now, so that's a sort of a key point in my MA thesis, looking at this feudal pattern of interaction as reflected by the airline system. Now, in retrospect, I think that there were many aspects of the network and the volume of interaction and supply and demand and so on that would have been equally interesting.
Alternative explanations.
But that was a perspective we took at the time. Of course, then with the Vietnam War and the student revolt in the late 1960s, the emphasis on dependency theory in the social sciences became even stronger. And Galtung developed the concept of structural violence, and some on the radical wing of peace research denied that the East-West conflict had any significance whatever. It was just a conspiracy to take attention away from the North-South conflict. Galtung also wrote the article called Structural Theory of Imperialism, which is probably his most widely cited article. And that, I think, went too far, sort of lost, peace research lost a little bit of perspective on other aspects of the world. And I think the concept of structural violence in particular was harmful to the development of peace research. Initially, it seemed like a very good idea. I mean, the idea was that you have other kinds of violence and the direct violence that one actor inflicts on another. You have violence embedded in the social system. And Galtung and Tord Høyvik, my colleague from Mathematical Sociology articles, did some interesting empirical work trying to quantify the amount of the number of deaths due to structural violence in the international system. That I think made a great deal of sense, but pretty soon structural violence became a sort of catch-all slogan for any real or perceived injustice, and so people come to PRIO with their research proposals, and there'll be something on structural violence on page 1, and then they've gone on for 10 pages about whatever they were interested in, and then they'd end with a note on structural violence at the end. It was a little bit like Soviet social science. You had to have a Lenin quote at the beginning of and the end. And I think this this helps to this, along with the increased skepticism in the 1970s about quantitative methods, I think helped to erode the profile of peace research.
So in a way, then you basically answered the next question about whether there were things that you believe should have received less attention. So now you've already touched on various the things that have been studied that maybe didn't lead or weren't as promising as we thought.
I think this overemphasis on dependency theory is one of the important aspects. And another thing which is curious, if you go back and look at the publication 50 years ago, I think the word democracy hardly was hardly ever found in peace research publications. So this whole wave of studies on the democratic peace and so on is largely due to people like Rudy Rummel and Bruce Russett and so on. Then he was picked up at PRIO and became cornerstone of PRIO's work too. But it was not seen as an important issue in the 1960s, 1970s. And it wasn't that it was rejected, it was simply, I think, ignored. Even though, to some extent, it was staring us in the face. So, the first empirical article on the democratic peace was written by an American criminologist, Dean Babst, in 1964. And what he did was extremely simple, but it's something that I think we ought to have discovered much sooner.
So some of the things that should have received more attention actually has received more attention in recently. So
eventually they have, yeah. But there may be things that I'm totally missing now. Some people like Ted Miguel and Marshall Burke and so on will say that we've missed the significance of climate change.
Yes.
And of course, this is a very controversial issue at the moment, and we became interested in that partly, I think, because Sverre Lodgaard, who was one of my early colleagues at PRIO, he went to SIPRI for several Stockholm International Peace Research Center for several years, came back to be the director of PRIO, and brought back with him Arthur Westing, who had written on environmental consequences of war. He's a real pioneer in that area. He has a background in forestry, so he was originally interested, I think, in deforestation in Vietnam and so on as a means of war. Now, he was also interested in environmental security and had a program with the United Nations Environment Program, which was transferred from SIPRI to PRIO. And then when he left to go back to the US to retire, I say retire because in his 85th year he's still extremely active, some of the activities in that program fell through the cracks, and I had to organize a conference on conversion and the environment held in Perm in Russia. The reason it was held in Perm was that part of the Soviet contribution to UNEP was paid in rubles, and the only way you could spend that money was by organizing a conference in the Soviet Union. Perm was previously called Molotov, so it was had been a closed city, so actually quite interesting to come there. And this is what led to my interest in in the relationship between the environment and conflict. And soon we shifted the attention from looking at the environmental consequence of war to looking at possible environmental causes of war. And it was quite obvious that the literature was dominated to a very large extent by a neo-malthusian model where resource scarcity is an important incentive for armed conflict. But there was also a skeptical, more optimistic or cornucopian, if you like, literature. So we picked up on this and started doing some empirical work and published, some early empirical articles trying to test the neo-malthusian theory of conflict. After a few years, I think the traditional neo-malthusian model lost a lot of ground, but then the climate change issue came on the political agenda and led to a revival in neo-malthusian thinking. And so we picked that up, and because you were there at the birth of this, but we found that the references to conflict and security in the reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change were not terribly well founded in the academic literature. And so a number of people here did studies on that, and we published a special issue of Journal of Peace Research a few years ago where a lot of the studies were relatively skeptical of the climate change to conflict link. But of course then a recent article in Science says that this link is incredibly strong and so on, so the controversy continues. Of course we now have very competent leadership of that program in Halvard Bruhaug, and I'm happy to sit on the sidelines and see him do the battle. Well,
but you're still active. You're still active in writing stuff.
Yes, I try to chip in a little bit.
So the next question is more related maybe to the people that have dominated the field. So we're wondering that if you had done an interview like this when you were in mid-career, who would you have wanted to interview if you were interviewing someone earlier on? Are there people from that time you would have liked to pick their brains?
Well, of course, my mentor was Johan Galtung, but I think after the early 1970s, the work he has done is much more speculative and less well-founded and solid empirical studies. But I've also followed his work closely enough so he wouldn't be at the top of my list for interviews, because I think I generally know both what his views were in the 60s and what his views are now. For his 50th birthday, I even edited his bibliography. And now, thinking back on some of the people I met in the early years, who are now dead, so you can't interview them. But let's imagine that we could. Kenneth Boulding. I spent a year at the University of Michigan in 1966-67 when he was still there, before he went to Colorado. Ernesto Verdeja was there. I met him. Karl Deutsch came to Michigan regularly, consulting with the Mental Health Research Institute, and was also associated with the Correlates of War project. So those are three people that I found very impressive at the time, and would have been interesting to go back and ask them about both the history and what they think of more recent developments. David Singer, of course, is another important pioneer, mainly as the founder of the Corridors of War project. But again, I feel that I've followed his work so closely that he's also dead now, but I wouldn't have the same need to interview him. I think I know where he stands.
Yeah, but it would be more about these are people that you think would have something interesting to say, that more people other than you also could have
yes.
found some interest in their insights. Yeah. The last question we have is, what do you think are the most exciting or promising areas in current research or future research? Well, of course, you had the comment about the jazz musician.
Yeah, let's go back to the question, my quotation from that jazz musician.
So maybe we should then ask about the things that are going on currently, more than predicting the future.
I think the trend towards looking at more disaggregated empirical studies is extremely exciting and could lead to some important new work. This is something that we noticed early on when we worked on the conflict data, that when you count it only at the nation level, you say, well, India has civil wars, or actually several. Russia has civil war, but they cover only small parts of the country. It's not as if the whole country was embattled in a civil war like the Spanish Civil War or the Chinese Civil War or other nationwide civil wars. So they're local wars of secession or whatever, and so developing new conflict data at the disaggregated level, and even more difficult, developing data for explanatory variables at the disaggregated level, I think is a very exciting development where I think PRIO is at the forefront of this work. I think the whole climate change debate is going to be with us, and it's going to be important too. But I remain skeptical whether the debate is going to be important. But I remain skeptical whether climate change is going to be very important in the total picture of conflict.
But there's still more work to be done. That's what you're saying with the disaggregation. I guess.
Of course. Well, of course. I mean the idea that you know everything in even any subfield of peace research, I think, is ridiculous. The more you know, the more questions you're able to ask. Well, one thing you haven't asked me about is how I nearly destroyed PRIO.
What?
How I nearly destroyed PRIO at one
did?
time.
No,
well,
okay, yeah, tell us that.
We were quite interested in the Norwegian alliance policy. I mean, a lot of my work has actually been on Norwegian politics. We did a lot of work on Norwegian attitudes to the common market, which has been a big political issue and leading up to 2 referenda. And along with a couple of colleagues, we worked a lot on public opinion before the first referendum. And we were arguing that there was a substantial chance that there'd be a no in the referendum, which eventually turned out to be the case. Whereas most of the pundits were predicting that the government will be able to sway public opinion to the other side. But then we were also interested in Norwegian alliance policy. Norway is of course a member of the NATO alliance, but it's had a policy of not permitting foreign bases on Norwegian territory since 1949, and also a policy of not permitting nuclear weapons to be stationed on Norwegian soil. But some of the critics of Norwegian foreign policy had noticed there were quite a few military installations on Norwegian, so they were funded either by NATO or bilaterally by the US, which were likely to play a role in strategic warfare in wartime. So even though we didn't have foreign bases in peacetime, preparations were made so that foreign bases could be set up very quickly in wartime. A number of airfields, for instance, were built so that they would be able to serve as starting points and receiving points for American strategic aircraft dropping nuclear weapons over the Soviet Union. Then we became interested in the electronic infrastructure, and initially in navigation systems, which seems again like an arcane subject. But when the Polaris missile submarines were developed and deployed in 1960, at that time navigation at sea was terribly inaccurate, so that there was a substantial risk that if a Polaris missile a Polaris submarine fired its missile, it would miss even a big target like Leningrad or Moscow. So the US Navy instituted a crash program for more accurate navigation at sea, called the LORA-NC program. And two of the first LORA-NC stations were built in Norway, and in great secrecy, not funded by NATO, but funded bilaterally by the US. This was both built in 1960. 15 years later, a public debate arose about this because of a thesis in political science written by a former captain in military intelligence. And so we started looking at that. I worked with a colleague from New Zealand, Owen Wilkes, who was technically much more knowledgeable than I was. We also used the American Freedom of Information Act to get documents from the Defense Department. And we were able to show that the reason for building the first and the second LORA-NC station in Norway precisely was the Polaris program. Even though the Norwegian authorities were trying to present this as a general navigation system for military and civilian use. Next, we became interested in military intelligence stations, and we found that you could easily locate a set of intelligence stations, mainly for signals intelligence. And we located them using the telephone directory and a list of sections of one of the public service unions. They had a separate section of the public service unions for intelligence personnel, and the locations of those stations, we looked at those with the telephone directory and so on, and we could figure out where the station were. We went off and looked at all of them and wrote a report where we speculated about the possible functions of these stations. And this created a big stink, and Owen Wilkes and I were charged with a national security violation and got 6 months suspended jail sentence for our efforts, and a big fine which was collected, so we didn't actually pay anything ourselves. This became controversial among some of my colleagues at PRIO too, so I might have been fired, and the institute might have been closed down. But eventually the political system decided, the major party decided not to interfere, and it was left to the judicial system to deal with us. So the only personal repercussions I had from this episode was that for about a period of about 4 or 5 years I couldn't get into the US. because I have a conviction. And even though there are people who have served time in jail, for instance, for congenital objection, who've simply failed to mention this when they applied for a visa. As a consul of the US Embassy explained to me, there's no way we can not know about your conviction because it was such a public affair. So eventually, with the help of the then Foreign Minister, Thorvald Stoltenberg, and a letter to the US ambassador, I was able to get an exemption. So for a while I had a one-shot visa, then I got a 1-year visa, then I got a 4-year visa. Currently I have a 10-year visa. And every once in a while I have to go to the back room in the airport talking to some higher official and explaining. Now this usually arises as a question, why do you have a visa? You come from a country that doesn't require visas to the US. Well, it's a long story. Well, please tell me. But that's the only personal problem I've had arising out of this. And it was kind of ironic when I received the Prize for Excellence in Research from the Research Council of Norway about 4 years ago. There was an editorial in Aftenposten, Norway's leading serious newspaper, praising the award to me and the guy who got the award for public information or popularizing research. And I had on file another editorial written by Aftenposten about me 30 years earlier, which said that unserious guys like this are a blemish on the research community. And the ironic thing was that my work on military intelligence was actually mentioned in the citation from the research councils. So things change.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for letting us talk to you. This was very interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome.